Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the agricultural industry. We aggregate those perspectives and work to elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. Thanks for joining today. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. We're going to try a new format today. In this show, we generally will pick a topic, a multivariable, multi-directional topic, and dig deep on it, maybe myself going at it, or it'll be a recurring topic that comes up time and again with multiple guests. The benefit of that is that we do get multiple perspectives, and we get a single voice's deep dive into the unique challenges, the angles of attack, the contributing factors, and we get a robust picture of how an individual, whether it's myself, a guest, etc., actually look at that. But what I think is also interesting to do is look at what are the themes that are showing up time and again in this program, in other podcasts that are out there, in the print literature and articles that we all consume online, in conversations we're having with one another and with our teams, topics that come up at industry events and agricultural conferences. The idea here is we pick one topic, we get multiple guests that have a credible point of view on the issue, and we have a discussion together in real time going deep on that one topic. So very much in the same spirit of what this show is all about, but a different way to approach it. And to start this experiment off, if this hits, we're going to do this again and again in the future. There's an infinite number of topics we could dig into. But to start this off today, we're going to talk about executive transition, particularly within the agricultural co-op complex. Things about succession planning for the top jobs in co-ops. How do you get people ready to be able to step into those roles? How do you define what those roles require based on the organization you want to create in the future rather than the organization you have today? How do you manage expectations? How do you look at the balance between we're building from within as a core cultural value, but also the very real diligence and obligation you might have to look outside and say, hey, what's the best talent the market has to provide? And all of this under the auspices of just talent management, which is so important to success and can be so challenging to get right. We want to look at all of this around the idea that it's all aligned to your strategy. A strategy is the expression of your desired future state and all the priority levers you're going to pull to get you there. And how do you make sure that the succession planning, the talent management, the recruitment and fulfillment processes, particularly in this case for the top jobs in co-ops, are actually aligned to that strategy? Now, to do this today, we're going to have two guests on. First is Kristen Ireland, who is the co-founder of PeopleSpark Consulting, along with Aaron Meese. PeopleSpark Consulting partners with agricultural businesses and people leaders to provide the tools, clarity, and confidence needed to build strong teams and resilient organizations. We're also going to be joined by Mark Washek, who is the president of Ag One Source. Ag One Source is an expert and specialized recruitment service provider covering most, if not all, key sectors within the agricultural industry and ensuring that you find the right talent for every niche in your business. Now, both Kristen and Mark are past guests on the pod. One of the reasons I reached out to them, they know what they're talking about. They have points of view. They know how to engage in a constructive discussion. If you missed those episodes, Kristen joined me with her co-founder, Aaron, way back in episode 74, in which we explored the importance of connecting people and strategy. And Mark was a guest back on episode 140, where we talked about Ag's talent deficit problem and what Ag leaders can be doing to navigate that. I should also mention that Kristen and Aaron also have their own really great show, the PeopleSpark podcast, and we're going to make sure that we have links to all of those episodes and shows in the show notes. So if you're not following those programs, if you missed those episodes, if you're not subscribed to the PeopleSpark podcast, I encourage you to do so. Now, before we start today's discussion, a quick reminder, as always, to please like and subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. If you're so inclined, let us know how we're doing. It is the very best way to support the program. It's easy and it doesn't cost you a thing. With that, thanks again for joining us today. And here's my conversation with Kristen and Mark. Kristen and Mark, it is really exciting to have you guys on the show today to play with a slightly different format than we've done in the past. So thank you for your willingness to do this and experiment in front of a hot mic with me. We have a lot to talk about today as relates the cooperative GM, cooperative CEO role, transition, succession, and kind of digging into those topics. You've both been on the program before, and so thank you for coming back. But for guests or audience members that maybe didn't hear those episodes or don't remember your backgrounds directly, I'd invite you both to take a moment to introduce yourselves, kind of the work that you do for the ag industry and how you interact with cooperative GMs. And Kristen, I'll hand it to you first.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you again for having me back on. I take that as a good sign. So my name is Kristen Ireland. I am co-founder of PeopleSpark Consulting. PeopleSpark Consulting, we work with small to mid-sized businesses within agriculture on developing ag leaders. And that goes from developing a frontline supervisor to working alongside a CEO or general manager, developing the strategy and skills for their businesses going forward. So really that whole perspective of developing leaders in the ag industry.
So not exclusively co-ops, but a pretty heavy presence within the cooperative system for your work.
Yes, for sure.
Very good.
Thanks, Joe. Mark Washik. I'm currently live in Minnesota. I've been with Ag One Source for almost 21 years, starting out as a recruiter, working my way up to the president of the organization. Prior to joining Ag One Source, my career was in the cooperative system. Right after college, I started my career as a sales agronomist, moved up to location manager, and then had roles within the corporate cooperative system within Senex Land O'Lakes, AgriAlliance, Land O'Lakes, and CHS organizations. So very well versed in the cooperative system. For the last 10 years of my career with Ag One Source, I have focused almost exclusively on executive level leadership positions, with the bulk of those projects being with cooperatives, working directly with boards of directors all throughout North America.
Very good. And so, Mark, I'm going to let you continue then. As we get into this discussion today, none of us have actually sat in the role of being a cooperative GM. Let's put that out there front and center. But we do all interact with those roles quite a bit via our work. But starting with you, Mark, as you think about that position today, how would you summarize the state of the job? Right? What are these folks spending their time on? What are the challenges? Kind of what do you hear most as you're working to fill these positions that are the primary needs of the organizations and what successful candidates will need to be able to be successful?
I would say that there's a definite consistency. Even though every situation is different, every financial situation is different, every culture is different, there's still a very solid thread of consistency between every organization I work with. And that is, especially if it's a retirement situation, but even if it's a situation where the board is making a change and they need somebody new. 20 years ago, talent management was not the number one issue concern that cooperative leaders had. Yes, were they worried about if there was an open position, or were they worried about if they lost a good person? Of course, right? But not to this level where the organization can fail if they can't physically find enough people to do the things that need to be done. That has changed dramatically, along with the fact that almost every general manager that I have talked to, just from a retirement standpoint, asking their opinions, if you were on the board today, what are you hoping they're telling me behind closed doors? And almost to a T, every general manager or CEO says something along the lines of, to get the organization where it is today, they needed a strong operational leader. But the cooperative system is changing, the structure is changing, the finances are changing for how you can run this organization. We can't win the asset war. We need people that are better at managing people and coming up with marketing strategies for us to be more effective in the marketing place. The traditional guy that knows the grains business or a guy that knows the fertilizer business may not be the right solution in the future. I hope they're thinking about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It actually parallels something we see at the board level, where you have this kind of what we sometimes call the complexity gap, where the nature of the organization that they're being challenged to oversee from a governance perspective is so radically different, both not just in scale, but in the nuance of the kinds of products and services you're delivering to members. that it creates a real challenge. You suddenly, the folks that maybe were really profoundly impactful governance bodies in the past are struggling to keep up. Kristen, your thoughts there on please.
I have a follow-up question for Mark. So you said that you were talking to GMs about what are you hoping that the board is telling me that the needs are? And I love that people are looking at it from that. It's different and really looking more, you don't need the strong operational. It's a lot of this, the more kind of strategic, bigger picture. What are you hearing from boards? And are you hearing from boards the same thing that you're hearing from general managers?
That's very inconsistent. And that really comes down to the culture and the dynamics of the board.
Mm-hmm.
As you guys know, and as a lot of people recognize, something happens around that, I'm going to say 6 or 7 year mark of a general manager or CEO, where the board starts to trust them and they shift from being an employee of the board to the board listening to what they have to say and approving their strategies, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a natural transition that the board stops questioning the CEO like they do when they start their job and start trusting them. And it evolves to where the general manager is truly driving the bus. When that happens, the board doesn't know how to answer that question, right? Because they're like, well, we like the last guy. Well, I'm sure you do, but my job is not to replace the last guy. My job is to help you take the organization. If that last manager took the organization from point A to point B, I'm looking for what do we need? What's that point C? So we're aiming for the right person. And that's truly probably the most challenging part of my role, is not finding the talent. It's making sure the board knows what we're looking for in the first place. So that is specifically why I asked that general manager, because that's my alignment question without asking the question, right? Because when I go into that boardroom meeting, I can tell whether or not a board and a general manager are truly aligned by the way that they answer those questions. And more often than not, they aren't. It's like they don't want to talk about it kind of a thing.
I would say, Joe, back to your original question, what we see is aligned with what Mark sees in terms of how we see that need shifting or the skill set shifting, that there is a lot of focus on the operational. Somebody was a good operations person, and now we need somebody to look at this from a bigger picture strategy perspective, that is the big shift that we see. I love, Mark, that you're also hearing the talent management, talent development need consistently in GM roles. Because obviously that's something that's very near and dear to my heart. So it's exciting that others are hearing that as well.
Well, in this episode, this discussion and this piloting of this model of discussion was born of multiple conversations that all pointed to friction and tension that emerges at the point of CEO succession. And so we're gonna transition there, because I think about the misalignment between the GM and the board. Very symptomatic of what will eventually become a succession challenge, right? What the organization needed to get where it is today versus what it needs to get where it's going in the future. Very symptomatic of tensions that will emerge later during succession. The historic profile of success being an operationally strong, long tenure, kind of tried and true, did my reps, now I'm ready, as being the path to the role, versus we need something radically different in terms of skill sets and aptitude. Again, all setting the stage for tension and succession. A question I have for you guys, and I did not do any sort of quantitative research. I didn't even do a Google search to try to figure this out. But let's put this into context, and maybe you have these numbers, maybe you don't. That's fine. But because this is all, we're talking about the transition of roles at the top of the house among the co-ops, what is the pace or the trend line of turnover in those roles look like today? And what I'm trying to get at is, I've seen and we've seen a number of pretty significant transitions among some of the larger cooperatives in terms of, retiring CEOs and new folks coming in, sometimes inside the co-op, sometimes outside. We've seen some folks take promotions to other organizations. So unplanned, non-retirement, non-performance driven transitions, and then smaller organizations as well. And I'm unsure if we have more turnover or less turnover in those roles, or that it's a steady state? This is a common sort of trend line of activity. So, Kristen, any thoughts that you have there? Have you seen more of these roles turning over? Is there more activity?
So it was different than what I anticipated. We started talking about succession planning, CEO transition, and I know we're focused on CEO, GM. I would say this across leadership teams because so many leadership teams, everybody was kind of promoted at the same time. So there is the retirements are happening kind of consistently. Since we started talking about it so long ago, I felt like it would drop sooner, where it feels like, one, not only is that still the discussion, and that's what I was just at an event a week and a half ago, and 3 different people that I was talking to were talking about having new CEOs that have started in the last 12 to 18 months. So it was a high majority that was still seeing that transition of CEOs. The other thing with that is how much succession planning is still a discussion point. I remember we first started delving into succession planning 5 to 7 years ago with everybody's going to leave in the next, 5 years, so we need to plan. And I was on I was leading a leadership discussion, facilitating a session, and succession planning was the top topic, that it's still so top of mind for everybody, which also tells me that it's still high. That being said, Mark, you're in the midst of it, actually doing the hiring. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I would say that it's an interesting dynamic that has a lot of different things that go into it, right? What I will tell you is that I believe it was at the Land O'Lakes annual meeting, it was discussed, but the average tenure of a current CEO or general manager in their system is under 7 years, right? And a lot of it is you got to have to think through the dynamics that go into that, because I thought it was going to be a lot higher than that, honestly, based on the people I'm talking to, because I spend so much time with 20 to 30-year veteran general managers, right? But that's buffered by the fact that when a lot of managers retire from organizations that are under $100 million, a lot of times a merger happens as the result of that retirement. That's kind of buffering that number, because that would actually be a turnover in general management, but instead it's a non-data point because they just become part of another organization, or the general manager goes with that and is the successor to the next general manager in the new organization, right? So those kind of dynamics buffer that a little bit. Plus the baby boomer leadership style era is on the down cycle, right? So we have less of those 25 to 30 year general managers that are doing that. But I think just the dynamic of still having cooperatives that are anywhere from $10 million to billions of dollars, there's so many in the lower third of that range that realize that they develop the skills. They maybe go from being a location manager or a regional manager with a larger cooperative, get that GM or CEO title on their resume so they can go back to the larger organizations that they enjoy being part of. And that creates a lot more churn at those low to mid-tier cooperatives because of that dynamic.
So a little bit of a detour here, but you said something that sparked thought and interest for me, Mark. This phenomenon of we have a retirement pending, and it somehow opportunistically lines up with a organizational merger and consolidation. For me, I always look at that with a bit of skepticism and say, man, that's a pretty expensive way to manage a succession process and avoid doing a market search or an internal scan. Because when you bring 2 organizations together and one of the GMs is going to retire, it's pretty obvious who the new GM is going to be. There might be examples where that's not, that existing GM didn't prevail. If there are examples like that, I don't know what they are. But, how often is that happening? And my gut tells me that's kind of a, maybe not reckless, but maybe a suboptimal approach. Your thoughts on that, and Kristen, I would invite your perspective as well there.
I would say that depends on the size of the cooperative and the size of their neighbors, right? So again, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, well, even Iowa, a lot of cooperatives in that $25 to $70 million range top line, right? There are still a lot of single location or 2 location cooperatives out there that are surrounded by much larger organizations. And some of them are profitable, some of them are up against the wall from a credit standpoint. And so it's almost a standard practice, I would say, with cooperatives of that size to consider their future and say, what is it going to take for this next manager to keep us viable 5 years from now as we look on this? And is this the right time, not just from a business standpoint, but from a membership standpoint, to bring this up to them? Because that's the other thing, as we all know, happens more often than we expect. Votes fail. And there's lots of reasons why merger votes fail. But if there was ever a time if a board has been trying to figure out how do we broach this topic with our membership, the beloved leader after 25 years stepping away to retire, not knowing who might come in, kind of builds on that a little bit. So I think they take advantage of that in some cases, but it is more of a standard practice than you might think for that size.
Well, it is encouraging to hear that there's those lenses applied of, what does membership require at this stage of the organization? And strategically, what is the best move for this co-op? Like I said, the cynic in me sometimes looks at that and says that that's an expensive, risky way to avoid a succession decision. But I think you're highlighting that there's probably multiple lenses that justify that as a tactic a bit more than what I was suggesting.
And that fits into, we're going to talk about this later, but it also fits into the recruiting strategy. Because I guarantee you, if I'm recruiting for a $50 million co-op that's surrounded by $500 million to $1 billion cooperatives, the very first question every candidate's going to ask me is, so how long is this going to last before they want to merge, right? So if they do this before I start the recruiting project, I can confidently say they have looked at it, they're profitable, there's no reason for them to merge, they're looking for somebody to take them to the next level of success. It helps me do my job, and it adds confidence to the incoming candidates as well.
Well, and to me, the biggest discussion is, are we looking at what the strategy of the business is? Knowing that they're saying, and I love the example that you use there of, okay, we've looked at it. That's not what our strategy is. Our strategy is to continue to invest, and this is what that looks like. My concern, so Joe, I picked up on the same thing that you did. My concern is that some of those discussions about what is our strategy going forward isn't happening. And it feels like an opportunistic moment without really thinking about what's the strategy going forward and what do we want to have accomplished. And that to me is such a critical, because the skill set needed, if that's where you're, hey, longer term, we see us merging with another organization or being acquired by another organization, that is a specific skill set that we can look for and hire for. If we haven't defined what success looks like and what our strategy looks like, we could be hiring the exact wrong person. I remember having a discussion with a single location co-op manager, and we were talking about strategy, and I was talking about what does success look like? And it was to be single location as long as we can. So it was very kind of tactical. We'll just keep doing what we're doing until we can't anymore, which is different than, we're a single location co-op. We are surrounded by all of these larger co-ops. We anticipate that this could happen. What do we need to do to make sure that we're ready for it? So to me, it's that bigger conversation of what is the strategy? What is the future? What do our members need? And what is the skill set that's going to get us there?
Right. The kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I visit with general managers, you said the same thing, and that is they're saying, look, for this cooperative to survive in the future, we are foregoing economies of scale. I have spent the last 25 years getting operational efficiency to where there is no more pennies to cut, right? The next person has to take a different approach because they are not going to be able to continue on this path because there's no money to save. We have to do something different.
So in the vein of strategy, and something we're not going to talk about, though I'm sure you guys both have lots of opinions on, who owns strategy in the co-op? Is it the GM or the co-op? Look for another upcoming roundtable format for that one. Let's talk about succession planning as the precursor, the long-term view of the organization, long-term planning, thoughtful strategic analysis around needs and requirements and the talent implications of that. That ought to start long before the GM says, I'm thinking about moving to Florida next year, right? You want this to be in play for a long time. And again, succession planning, to your point, Kristen, is at all levels of the organization. Certainly, a couple levels down, at least from the GM. But solely for the GM, when you think about the succession planning process, start with you, Kristen. Who owns that process today and who ought to own it?
It is so funny that you said that, because that is one of the notes that I wrote down, because there are so many times that we're talking to general managers who are looking at moving forward and they're saying, that's the board's role to identify who that next person is. That's not necessarily my role. And to Mark's point, talent development, talent management is a key part of their discussion. So as much as they may not make the decision about the next general manager, they do own whether or not they're developing the necessary skill sets to do that. So to me, when you talk about ownership, having that clear line of ownership and making sure that there is alignment, Mark, to your point of you're asking this question for alignment as you're starting that search, how do we back that up further so that we are planning and having that conversation between the GM and the board to make sure that there is alignment so that the GM can take that responsibility of developing the people internally to meet the skill set that the board is looking for going forward. But there are a lot of GMs who are like, but I'm not the one who can make that decision. It's a board decision. You're right. And you are responsible for making sure that somebody is prepared coming forward. So it's important that you understand what the board is going to be looking for so that you can develop the skills and tools that person needs.
Mark, what do you see around?
I agree. And I feel that it's that lack of communication is really the issue. On top of the fact that when you have that transition where the board stops asking questions and start coming to the meeting to hear what the CEO has to say, they back off on their need for business planning, for annual planning, strategic planning. And the succession plan, I don't want to say goes out the window, but it's pretty hard to hit a target that isn't there, right? And so many managers, not deliberately, but more by default, start saying, okay, well, if the board likes the way that I'm doing things, I'm going to start bringing people up to help them understand how I approach these problems and what I do so that they're ready. When I retire, the board has 2 or 3 internal candidates and we don't need to go on the outside. However, the board may be thinking, look, we're getting out of the grain business or we're going to do something different. We have to be more aggressive in acquisitions. And if everybody has been trained under the old management style or coming from those divisions that the board may be thinking to get rid of, that succession plan goes out the window. So it really, it's a combination of both communication, but just annual business planning and strategy planning is so critical to a CEO being able to bring the right people up at the right time. Otherwise, we end up with a lot of frustration, which is what I end up dealing with a lot because that never happened.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
So that begs this question. If you've got this GM, and you said it was 6 to 7 years, I think, Mark, as we said at that point, the board starts to get very comfortable. They may not, as a matter of policy, defer to the CEO, but they certainly start to be more deferential through their decisions and their questions and how engaged they are. So if you've got a GM, a high ownership, high effectiveness, doing a great job, driving change in the organization, driving growth, delivering results, and they take it unto themselves to start to develop that next generation of talent. And then it comes to the point at which they're going to leave. And now, of course, the decision does move back to the board. I would imagine this introduces some tension where if a board says, we trust Mark's gut He's done a great job for us. He's forward thinking. He's innovative. We think the 2 or 3 people he's been working on are pretty promising, but we also feel like we owe it to membership to validate that readiness against the marketplace. Does a tension emerge there, Mark?
Every single time.
People who've been going through it internally for years are on the list. They're part of the bench. They're getting ready, and the board still says, "Well, we got to go look outside." What do you see, and maybe what helps folks navigate that successfully, or what gets in the way?
Yeah, that really happens almost every single time, which highlights probably why I talked about it so much. Is that lack of communication and lack of ownership and lack of strategy really comes to head at that point in time when the board decides to use an outside recruiter to search for candidates. There's a lot of frustration with general managers because they feel, why is the board doing this? Even though they understand the situation where the board may want to just double check, they're saying, look, I've spent 10 years bringing these people up. What's there to check? Look at the risks that you may bringing into this organization by having an outside person here. You have people that know our business, know our customers, know our culture. It's going to be the smoothest transition possible. Why would you even consider looking on the outside? So it adds a bunch of dynamics to that where it almost creates an us versus them in some cases where the last few months of a general manager's role can be quite tense in some cases. I've seen it get tense from the standpoint that they're frustrated. They may have made promises to some people. The board may be taking a very different approach, even though they've talked about it in board meetings of here's where the business is going. Nobody's connected the dots on that. Means we may need a different style of leadership. But more importantly, it adds tension to the employee base, because depending on how the general manager has talked about their future and the succession plan, I'm not going to say publicly, but within the culture of the leadership of that organization, and it drips down a little bit. If a general manager tells one division manager, look, you're on the short list, I just want you to know I am going to push for you. That division manager has to do their part and go to their next person down and say, look, there's a chance I might be the next CEO. If that happens, you're my guy. And it just goes boom, 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 boom down the list, right? When the board sends out a press release that they've engaged with an outside recruiting firm, that creates a lot of tension in the whole organization. And they see the recruiter having more impact on the business than they really do. The job of a recruiter is not to decide who the next CEO is. The job of a recruiter is to look at an entire pool of candidates and assess them based on the future of the organization and what the board feels is the right type of person to take them there, and see of this pool of candidates who best aligns for that, and help the board interview those candidates on their own merit. We do not say, and because of that, here's the person we think you should choose. We don't do that. The board does that. But there's a feeling within an organization that when you hire an outside recruiter, we have influence on that. But at the end of the day, it's the board, and it's based on where the board wants the business to go, not based on who's internal or external. And that's a little bit of a misnomer amongst a lot of folks in that organization that they don't quite understand because nobody's explained it to them.
And I feel like as you talk about that communication aspect, one of those key aspects of communication is what does success look like for that role? And again, that should start long before we have this conversation of what are the critical skill sets that a next general manager is going to have. So when a board is engaging with an external recruiter, they have those aspects identified, how they're going to measure or compare people, and that the general manager has that to be able to develop the people with them. Because to your point, if they're not communicating and there isn't that alignment, the board is developing these people to be similar to how they do it, which is different than the board saying, okay, here are the things that we're looking for. So making sure that we're using the same measuring stick is the analogy that comes to mind, and that's not the appropriate one. But what are the standards that we're looking for so that that is defined, and that the GM, as they are developing the succession plan and the people coming behind, that they make sure that they're developing the skills
right
that the board is looking for. So having that discussion and alignment ahead of time, which also then would prepare you more when you are hiring an external recruiter to say, okay, here are the things that we've been working on, and this is why.
One of the things that we spend a lot of time on is exactly that, for that exact reason, right? What I can tell you that when I kick off a CEO search with the board of directors, that meeting can go anywhere from 2 hours to 8 hours. And the difference in that 6 hours is usually exactly that. They don't fully agree on where they're going and what it takes to get there. If a board has just come out of a phenomenal strategic planning session where they say, look, here's our 3-year goal. To get there, we need to be at this within the first year. That makes my job really easy. But unfortunately, I have a lot more 6 to 8 hour meetings than I do 2-hour meetings, because that is not something that they focus on, because board meetings have shifted to backward looking and reporting versus forward looking. And that comes to light when we have that conversation. And so, to your point, our search can't start until we understand exactly what success looks like that very first year. And the reason why we focus on the first year, not so much the long-term strategy, is at this level, you have to have either done it before or have the ability to do it to hit that goal. You can't learn on the job fast enough to hit a 1-year mark as a CEO, right? And so I need to fully understand what the board's expectations are, what an A+ looks like, so that we can make sure the candidates align with that. If they have other things that they've done in their career that align with the 3-year goal, that's icing on the cake, and that's what we talk about in the interview process. But from a screening standpoint, both myself, my team, and the entire board of directors, we all have to be aligned on, they have to have done this before, because we need this done by December 31st. Without that, you have situations where boards are frustrated or CEOs are frustrated because you have misaligned expectations before the person even starts.
Right. Well, and I think about, so that's 6 to 8 hours of conversation that you're having as we're starting the search. And we may have general managers who have been developing their backup, the person that they think would be really good for it. Well, if you don't have that and you have to work on it for that 6 to 8 hours, what has the general manager been developing in those others? And it's quite a split.
A big thing here too I'm seeing is there's this almost call it like a frequency of occurrence risk that emerges. So in a typical co-op, you don't need to spend a whole lot of time convincing the VP ops and all of his regional managers that we're going to have to be sweeping bin bottoms in the spring and getting storage ready for harvest. Because everybody's made the mistake of not sweeping the bin bottom for a couple of years, and then suddenly you realize you have huge inventory quality issues, you've got, write-downs, you've got operational problems, etc. People know that you're going to have to be able to stage and stock, your spring application inventory in a certain manner according to the weather patterns, planting intentions, pre-orders, all that kind of stuff. We know there's things we have to do in advance, because every 12 months we're confronted with the same challenge if we don't do it. A CEO succession, there's many board members that I've worked with at this point of saying we also need to think about a new CEO that have never done it. They have been in that role the entire time, or they came in right when the current GM was, named. And so I guess, Kristen, from your standpoint, because you put it very articulately around, the problem that emerges and how to tackle it, how do you create the urgency with the CEOs that you work with that they need to find a way to get this message across to the boards that we need to collectively identify our roles and responsibilities, articulate what success looks like, and recognize that we each have a role in this process between management and ownership to make sure that we don't get bit in the backside, because we're going to do this once every 7, 10, 15, 25 years.
Well, and I think part of this is a reframe of, sure, that's what's needed for a CEO search. The reframe in my mind is, Mark, what you were saying earlier in terms of talent development, talent retention, talent management is a key aspect of any CEO. So this isn't necessarily having somebody prepared to take over the GM role. is a part of it. Bigger picture, it's how are we developing and retaining the people that are there? And if we frame it less as this is to address the CEO search and more of this is to develop and retain our talent, then it becomes a much more consistent conversation and more, it's critical now, not we don't have to worry about that for the next 5 to 7 years, because truly that's what it is. And I would add to that those discussions are not, and I'm going to say this as harsh as should not necessarily be role specific, but skill set specific. Because that's what we also hear, to your point of, okay, you're going to be the one that I'm going to bring forward. Well, then it's so dependent on the role. So when it doesn't happen, then somebody is frustrated and they leave, and there goes our retention. More of what types of roles are you interested in going forward? So I'm envisioning the GM having a discussion with the people that report to him or her. What kinds of positions are you interested in going forward? If we were to look at a GM role here's what it looks like. What other roles are you looking for? What are the skill sets that you feel you need to develop? And let's work on developing those. So it's not somebody saying, okay, I'm working hard to get this specific job. That may be an outcome. I'm working hard to develop my skills in these areas to prepare me for whatever is next. And all of us can hope that it would be that GM role. And if it's not, you're still looking at it from wow, I may not have gotten that. Now I'm even more prepared for other discussions that we've had. So looking at it from a broader talent development perspective and keeping that top of mind rather than this specific pain point or this specific issue of CEO search, and less specific on role, more specific on skill sets.
I don't want to speculate too much, but based on observed behaviors and reactions from some individuals, including conversations that we've all had amongst ourselves, the mere act of hiring an external recruiter, and you said something to this similar effect earlier, Mark, sends a signal or sends an unintended signal. One of which to the GM could be they don't trust my discretion or they don't trust what I have done. So to you both, for any significant role in the organization where the decision's been made to go to the marketplace to evaluate what the market can provide from a people perspective, how do you message that in such a way that it doesn't disengage the people who thought they were preparing themselves for that role and now have to compete with external folks, or their managers who thought they were preparing them for those roles as well? If I'm making myself understood, I think there's probably this reaction is going to happen, and we probably need to be doing a better job of getting in front of it. Because I would advocate that for many, many positions, you ought to do some kind of external scan. Maybe not every position, but many of them. But there's this message that is sent. So how do we message this better in the moment when it happens? If we don't have all the other pieces in place that you guys have been talking about.
Well, I think the reality of using an outside recruiter, you can say from a membership standpoint, it's the right thing to do because we want to make sure that we hire the best person. The same goes for the internal candidates that, again, every recruiter operates differently, but if you do everything possible to ensure it's a level and open conversation playing field, that you treat internal candidates and external candidates the same. They all go through the same interview process. They all have the same information. They all understand the expectations that they're going to need to succeed in this role based on what the board's looking for. Very rarely, if that happens, very rarely does an internal candidate feel slighted because they now realize that that person got the job because they can do this and this, and I haven't actually developed that yet, so it makes sense, right? Because if you think about it, you can still have that same tension where there's a lot of general managers. I can even think of an organization well over $1 billion that did this recently. So we aren't going outside. We have our 3 internal candidates. I would think the 2 that didn't get the job might feel more slighted than an internal candidate versus an external candidate, right? The same tension exists in that type of environment. The key is to make sure that everybody understands what the board is looking for and why. And you have the self-reflection of, wow, this is not what the CEO told me. But now that I understand what the board's looking for, it kind of makes sense why they're going this direction. But if you actually get the job in your internal candidate, that validates everything that you have done, and you can go into that role with far more confidence versus people saying, is he really the best or just the only one we had? Right? Big difference.
For an internal candidate, it is, I'm going to say better, but they're better positioned as a leader if they are the candidate selected from a pool, including external candidates, than to your point of they were the best one internally or they were the one that was picked. But people can't question it then when they know that they've been put up against external. And to me, that's one of the benefits that isn't talked about. I think the other thing that's important to that too is then what is the follow-up conversation? And who is having the follow-up conversation with the internal candidate who's not getting it to say, okay, here is where you shine. Here is where we saw your strengths. Here are the areas for development. Let's talk about what we can continue to do to develop you in that area. Where I think so many times it's like, oh, this person got it. And we focus now on how are we onboarding this person into the role and not focusing on how are we supporting the people that didn't.
Even the people who aspire to be in that role and didn't even get a consideration. That silent base of the pyramid that says, I knew it wasn't going to be me now, but I'm hoping it can be me next time.
Right.
And I raised my hand to express interest. I didn't even get a phone call or a coffee chat. Something I want to just kind of close on here, though.
That's such a miss.
It's such a miss. You can make decisions in an effort to manage flight risk and say, look, if we go outside, we risk losing everybody inside or losing our primary person inside. But you made a good point there, Mark, that if you've got 3 internal candidates and you hire one of them, you might still lose 2 of the other 3. Because if that was sort of the penultimate role they were going for, they've now seen that seat got occupied and that person's in that role for probably quite a while. And there's only so many CEOs I can outlive before I'm ready to hang it up and retire. And so unless you truly only have one internal candidate, you probably are facing a flight risk situation. And if you really only have one internal candidate, you could argue that's all that more important than you validate against the marketplace. So we're coming up at the end of time, and I want to leave our listeners with maybe a couple of actionable sort of takeaways. Not that they don't have actionable takeaways already, but to kind of distill it down to some of its simplest parts. When you guys are thinking about succession planning and transitions, particularly at the executive level, what's the 1 or 2 things that you would coach every board and every CEO to be thinking about and doing? Like, do these 1 or 2 things, and you're going to dramatically improve your outcomes of success. It could be tools, frameworks, processes, even questions to ask.
1, I would say have that discussion with the board of what really are they looking for? What's the strategy and what are the skills and experiences they want to have in a GM role? Even though I'm saying GM role, talking about this in terms of broader talent management and talking to the people that report to you. And I'm going to qualify that with, don't assume that you know what they want. Stop and ask the question, because there may be a lot of people who you assume don't want a GM role who may and just are too hesitant, but we haven't asked, so we don't know. And have some of those conversations going so you know what people want to have. And then as you start to develop them, make sure that we're specific. And I realize that I'm going a little bit this way on your conversation, which, to be fair, I told Joe I would totally do. I was talking to a CEO at one point who was looking to retire. Ironically, there was a merger conversation happening at the same time. Prior to getting to the merger conversation, I said, do you have any internal candidates? And he said, yes, I have 3 internal candidates. So I said, let's go through each one. What do they have? What do they need? What makes them a good candidate? And when we first started to talk about the first person, I said, okay, so what does this person need to be ready? And he said about 3 years. And I said, 3 years to do what? And he couldn't answer that. So he was saying, I think this person needs some more time, but there was no concept of what are you going to do with that time? What specific skills and experiences do they need to have to be ready? And so many times we look at it in terms of what's the time frame that we need, not necessarily what specific skill sets does that person need, which goes back to get alignment from your board so that when you are having these conversations of you could be ready in 3 years, you can talk to the person about here are the things that need to happen in those 3 years. So I did do this, and I couldn't not tell that story.
And our listeners can't see the emphatic hand gestures of Kristen as she walked us through the detours and and their paths. But thank you. Point taken. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, I'm going to dovetail into what Kristen said, and that is, on top of that, before I tell you my 2 steps, is I don't know what the number is. You two might know, Kristen, you in particular. There's this crazy high percentage of kids that are going to college this fall, my son being one of them, for a degree that may not exist in 4 years, right? Because the evolution of business is happening so fast. And it just occurred to me, when a CEO or a general manager says, oh, I've got this person on a 3-year plan, is that a plan to nowhere, right? Because things are changing that fast, right? Which goes to my 2 points of strategic planning. There are some organizations that take it seriously. Some do it because they have consultants or vendors that are pestering them to do it. Some that say, well, we're making money, so why should we change anything, right? Succession planning is so highly aligned with strategy. If there's one thing that I can tell you that organizations can improve on to ensure that their succession plan is on track and they are able to promote candidates internally versus requiring to have to go on the outside, it is aligning business strategy with the talent management of that organization. That's not happening in many organizations today, right? The other thing that I would say comes up more often than you would expect it to is taking performance management seriously. And that starts at the board level, right? Because you can't effectively decide who you're going to move up in the organization and what investment you're going to make in them without a performance management system to put the guardrails along that. And it starts at the very top. When I'm saying the very top, that's the board of directors, right? Going back to that 6 to 7 year thing, everybody gets comfortable. We're making money. Things are good. We have our CEO on a contract that says he gets an X% raise and his bonus is based on net profit or member equity or return on capital, whatever it is, right? Why do we need to do an annual review? We made money, right? Well, guess what? That just trained the general manager not to do it with their direct reports and so on down the line. And you have no methodology to actually initiate and drive that succession plan forward because nobody's taking performance management seriously in the entire organization. And it's crazy how many organizations have that you think of as highly successful organizations. But I come out of my kickoff meeting with one of the number one objectives more often than not is not profit. It's to implement a performance management system because it's lacking in every company I work with. And that is as big of a part of succession planning as strategy.
You know, it's fascinating that you say that because that's one of the things that Aaron and I found when we started PeopleSpark Consulting is we want to make sure that we align our talent strategies to the business strategy. And then people would reach out to us and we'd say, okay, well, let's talk about your business strategy. So how can we align your performance management, your hiring, your succession planning, your development around that? And how many times there wasn't a strategy in place to be able to have that conversation. So you just made my heart sing right there, Mark. I just met Mark, and Mark just made my heart sing by talking about the importance of performance management and tying it to strategy.
Well,
I may know my audience.
It worked.
Aside from the obvious tactic of hire Moser Consulting Group to do your strategic plan and Kristen and Aaron to do your people system development and then hire Mark ultimately to manage the transition, I do think that there's one, to distill it down to a couple of things that I heard that I agree with is one, don't look at succession planning separate from strategy. It's one and the same. And you could make an argument that every strategic plan ought to have a lever on there around business continuity from a talent perspective. starting with the board and the CEO. What are we doing to make sure we have healthy governance, healthy executive leadership, healthy upper management, and a healthy bench? The other thing is articulate what readiness looks like. And we've always advocated for organizations that are looking to get started with any sort of succession planning, don't over-engineer it. You can start with something as simple as categorize somebody for a role as ready now, ready soon, ready later. Mm-hmm. And ready now could be 0 to 6 months. Ready soon is 6 to 18 or 24 months. Ready later is sometime beyond that. And then to Kristen's point, articulate what is required to get them ready. So don't stop at the duration, start to populate it with actions and experiences. So Kristen and Mark, again, I want to thank you both for taking the time to join today. I sincerely appreciate it. It's kind of fun to play with a new format and share some ideas. I'm sure our listeners are going to appreciate it. And so, just want to say thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
And to our listeners, I appreciate you being part of the Pacesetter Pod community and taking the time to listen in and consider ways that you can turn strategy into outcomes in your agribusiness. Thanks for joining, and we look forward to having you next time right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.